The Peace of Augsburg is a temporary settlement that happens in the Holy Roman Empire. Basically, this is a temporary settlement that brings peace between the Protestants and the Catholics. What it basically says is that in the Holy Roman Empire, which is a lot of Central Europe, Germany, that princes can decide if they want to be Catholic or if they want to be Protestant. And what happens is most of Northern Holy Roman Empire is Protestant, and most of the Southern Holy Roman Empire remains Catholic. The Edict of Nantes is basically an edict that gives the Huguenots, or the French Protestants in France, which was mostly Catholic, gives them rights to live in the nation, substantial rights that they can stay there. So this is basically signed by King Henry IV of France, and it gives Protestants who are in France, who are a religious minority, rights to live in that country, provided, again, this is a big deal, is that as long as they are Christian. So basically, Protestants can live in a Catholic country and have rights in France. The 30 Years' War was a huge war that happened all over Central, Western Europe in this era. It starts off as a war between the Protestants and Catholics, but then gets more complicated because the French take the Protestant side, and it gets really complicated. A lot of fighting, a lot of death, a lot of violence. At the end of it, though, finally, there's basically a realization that Catholics aren't going to win, Protestants aren't going to win, and it will really shape and make a lot of the current borders that exist in Europe after many years of violence from 1618 to 1648. So it's violent, it's really bad, there's lots of fighting, but eventually it will allow to have some Protestant nations, some Catholic nations, and tolerance for each other in Europe at that time, and will shape modern European nations that we know today, like France, Britain, Spain, etc. The Peace of Westphalia is basically a number of peace treaties that end the 30 Years' War. The big significance is that the Holy Roman Empire becomes a lot weaker. Nations like France actually get some strength out of this. Britain becomes strong after this. And it ends the European wars of religion. And we'll have Protestant nations, and we will have Catholic nations that will have to learn to live together. And they do for the most part. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, a series of armed conflicts that will happen, and really a big result of the English Civil War is that parliamentarians, known as Roundheads, will become a lot more powerful than the Royalists, the Cavaliers, who are more attached to the royalty. At the end, there will still be royalty that will exist in England. However, the Parliament will gain much power as opposed to a place like France, whereas absolutism and the king still has a lot of power. In England, Parliament, or the people who are representatives, will have more power at the end of this war. We're going to skip the Puritan Revolution, cross that one off. The Glorious Revolution happens after the English Civil War, and what happens is there's the overthrow of King James II by England, by English parliamentarians, and they bring in William III, Prince of Orange he was called, and they bring him in to be the king. And the biggest thing you have to know about the Glorious Revolution is it becomes a realignment. There becomes the monarchy, or the king and queen have less power, and Parliament has more. But they do work together. So you still have the king who has power and the Parliament who has power. But we're seeing a shift in England where Parliament's gaining power and the monarchy is losing power in this revolution. However, they keep a monarchy, but the Parliament has power again, and this is different than places like Spain and France at this time, which have more of absolutism, where one king has absolute power. In England, the king can't do whatever he wants. Parliament kind of controls the pocketbook or the money. The English Bill of Rights is an act that comes out of Parliament, or the representative body, like a Senate. And this is basically creates a separation of powers that limits the power of the king and the queen, gives more power, or again, Parliament has power, and gives more power to democratic elections in England, and gives people more freedom of speech so they can actually say things against Parliament a bit and also against the monarchy. Not totally, but it gives them more freedom of speech than what they had. And will lead to the Bill of Rights, which also exists in the United States. The Toleration Act of 1689 is basically an act that gives power and a voice to people who are Protestants but not from the Church of England. So it gives religious minorities more freedom, and they can express their opinion and can express their religious beliefs. It gives more power, it gives them more freedoms than they had. And this came out of the Glorious Revolution. The divine right of monarchy is kind of like the mandate of heaven if we go back to China. It's the divine right of monarchy or divine right of kings, that kings were basically chosen by God to rule and that people cannot question them. This is much more powerful in France than in England at this time, and in Spain, where we see absolute monarchs who have absolute power. And they say, our power comes from God. How dare you question us? More in France and Spain at this time, but basically saying that you cannot question or you cannot go against the king. This will come to an end eventually. A few heads will be lost in the process. The Palace of Versailles, or Versailles. This was King Louis XIV's palace in France. This palace was absolutely huge. He built it just outside of France, and he made all of the nobles basically come and live there, and basically kind of brought the nobles in and consolidated or took power, as King Louis XIV will become definitely an absolute monarch and will have his palace, and his nobles will have to live a courtly life near him so he can keep an eye on them, and also become a place of extravagant wealth. And extravagant, basically all these events that happen with the nobles and the king, and it is a place and a symbol of the power of the absolute monarch that it was in France at this time. We're going to skip to sepoys. So let's go to sepoys. Sepoys were an Indian soldier under British or European orders. This will be when Britain goes into India, the British East Indian Company becomes powerful in India, and starts paying Indians to be in their military. It will start with the British East Indian Company hiring these soldiers, who are Indian soldiers, who are working as soldiers for the British. The Five Great Farms. The Five Great Farms was a program established in France, basically to take these large farm areas and to get rid of all tariffs and taxes and make it more of a free trade area within France. It allowed there to be more food produced, more trade to be in France to go back and forth without having to worry about paying taxes from region to region, which allowed France to have a stronger economy, more trade, and grow economically during this time.